Hello, this is Chris Ott, and this is part 20 of this series, What Mayor Baba Really Taught. Um, Today I'm going to talk about something that I haven't gone into before. Those who follow me at all know that I've written two books. One is The Evolution of Perception, and the second one, which was more recent, is Evolution of Perception Re-Explained. Now, Evolution of Perception, which here we'll just call EOP for short. EOP is an idea that I came up with about 24 years ago. It really hit me all of a sudden when I was studying philosophy. It hit me when I was on a campus bus, and I kind of jotted some notes, and I've been trying to develop ways of explaining it and refining it ever since. And but what I haven't talked about is in relation to Mayor Baba's teaching and what Mayor Baba really taught, the way in which this idea, when understood, the evolution of perception, especially when its charts are examined and you sort of get an intuition of what they're conveying, helps you understand what Mayor Baba really taught. Now, that's not surprising because naturally I grew up exposed to the teachings of Mayor Baba, and a lot of it was kind of unclear, subconscious, kind of like, you kind of get it, absorb it, bit by bit, overhearing it, reading some here and there. But though that understanding that I had of Mayor Baba's teaching, that did influence this idea. So it would be natural that this idea would be close, kind of a match. And so I want to explain the idea so that I can go over how it's useful that way. I think people see my idea, and it's not obvious that it would relate to the sayings of Mayor Baba, because the pictures are unfamiliar. I'm going to show some of the charts I've done over the years. I mostly use old charts that I did I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. I don't really do them again. They seem fine to me. Maybe I should redo them, but I like them. There's a couple of them in my second book. There's none in my first book, but they exist online. And okay, so let's get into this. I called this. This is the only talk that I've given where I actually wrote a paper that I'm going to link to in the show notes. You go to that link, and it'll take you right to these this essay, if you want to call it an essay. It's kind of just my notes, but written carefully to lead me through what I want to say today. So, but it has a lot of material that one might want to read more carefully. And so it goes to my Google Drive where it's stored, and you can download it or read it online. But the name of this is How EOP Sheds Light on Baba's Most Difficult Teachings. Or the longer title is How the Concept of the Evolution of Perception opens a window to understanding the meaning of some of the most difficult mystical expressions of Mayor Baba, as well as other mystics throughout the ages. And I'm going to go over some of those, like things that Jesus said. So, to preface this, why this comes up. Over the years, I have heard people complain that they could not understand certain expressions that Baba says. And they actually explain, how they're counterintuitive and they don't make sense to them. And they try to, using common sense. So examples are, Baba said, "You and I are not we, but one. We're all one." Well, it's obvious that we're two. He even said the word we. So isn't he contradicting himself? And that, it's not self-contradictory that we're not we, but we're one. So we'll see what that means through these charts. It'll help. Our time does not exist. How could time not exist? I mean, it took time for you to say time does not exist. So how could time not exist? Or the world is an illusion. That bothers people a lot. Even though that's not original by Baba, they're mystical schools that say that. But the way they argue with it, protest, especially, maybe they've even followed Baba for a while, but then it just starts to bother them. Does this really make any sense? And the way they try to point out the problem is using common sense. So they go, look, see this table, it's solid. My hand doesn't go through the table. So and I have to be quiet because they're not really interested in hearing how it could be an illusion. But if there were, I would point out, but Baba doesn't say you can't perceive the world. That wouldn't even be an illusion, would it? That would I don't know what that would even mean. And feeling a table is part of the perception of the table, and your hand not moving through the table when you smack it, or is based on the laws of physics. That could be an illusion. All right, that doesn't prove those things are real, that you experience them. It just proves they're in your experience, but it doesn't prove that they're outside or independent of your experience. That's the point. But anyway, I shouldn't be talking about that now. I was just giving some examples. So here I want to show that the principle I've talked about for so long, that I've called the evolution of perception, gives us a way to understand mystical statements like these. In a very simple way, without all that discourse like I was just starting to forget myself and get into. You can just look at the chart and you get it. And once you understand the charts, it's easier. And why there are these charts. So how does this principle, the evolution of perception, EOP, a principle I published 2 books about, shed light on these sayings? And others, many others. Well, before I can answer that, I have to go over one more time EOP, because EOP is something very hard. You can understand it when it's explained very often, but then you can't get it back easily. So I have to go over it again. Okay, so to understand EOP, we first need to look at a problem that philosophers and more recently scientists have had and struggled over for centuries. Whenever scientists have tried to come up with a story to account for how the world got here and how it came to have the characteristics we observe in it, they inevitably make a logical mistake. This is one of the things that I realized over the years as I was developing this idea. This mistake is the cause of all kinds of problems later. The mistake is to imagine some object existing in the start of their story, at the start of the process that created the world, that can only exist at the end of that creative process. Since it only comes about as the result of the process, how could it have existed before the process happened? Okay, that's very simple, but it is a big thing in philosophy, and a lot of philosophers don't even understand this. I'm going to get into what that fallacy, but I'll give a quick example. So there are objects that we see, and they're like I see a horse, and I see a circle, and I know that's a circle, and I know that's a horse. But how do I know that's a horse? How do I know that's a circle? Well, that's a question that Plato asked, and he came up with a theory of forms. And the idea was that somehow in the past we had experience of a perfect circle and a perfect horse, and those were ideals. And when we were born, we had we recollected these when we saw one, so we knew what this was. So this is very strange, but it's the theory of forms. So there's a world for everything you see, there's a world where there's a perfect one, called its form. But you notice when he's explaining how we have the concept of of objects like horses and circles? The answer is we saw horses and circles. But how did we recognize them when we saw the forms before we were born? You still have the problem. It's because he's done this. He's taken something he's trying to explain. He's trying to come up with a story to explain horses and circles. And what does he put in his story? Sort of magical horses and circles. So he's done the same. Now, in Genesis, in the Bible, we ask, well, how did we get here? People, and animals and everything. Well, so especially ourselves, where do we come from? And well, it turns out the answer is that people come from a person, God. And in Christianity, at least, God is technically a person. He doesn't have a body, but he thinks just like us, and if we could see him, he looks just like us because we are created in his image. And so the answer to where are people from is people, a person. So you see, you've taken that which is in the appearances that is what you're trying to explain, and you're putting it back into its cause. Now, hardly anybody literally believes that idea anymore. Well, there are people, but I think very few philosophers buy the Genesis literally anymore. And one more example is atomism. Atomism has a form back in ancient Greece, but it also has its modern form. But the problem is in both of them, and that especially in the earliest Greek one. But let's say I see an object like a rock, a clump of something, and I want to explain it. How do you have that? And then I say, well, there were these smaller clumps, and they were called atoms. Well, there still are. And the atoms come together and make these bigger clumps. So what are clumps made of? Clumps. You get it? So to explain something, I just put it back into its cause. I'm reading the effect into its cause. And the other Greeks, by the way, besides the atomists, saw serious problems with atomism right away, and it was not accepted until really the Renaissance. They called it. What did they call it? The idea of particles. I can't remember, but they had another name for it. And anyway, that's basically the theory we have today. Things are made of atoms. Well, where did the atoms come from? Well, we don't have a whole lot about that, except sort of a lot of metaphor that scientists come up with recently. So now the error in the thinking has a name, and it's called the historical fallacy. So you're taking something from the current, and historically you're putting it back where it really couldn't have existed because the process that created it hadn't happened yet. And this was named by an American philosopher in the late 1800s, John Dewey. And John Dewey explains it in a paper called The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology. And that still exists online and links from this paper. And he wrote that in 1896. Strangely, it's been pretty much universally ignored by other philosophers. I kind of discovered it, and I discovered it one day. And I've been telling people, and they don't even know what I'm talking about. It has to do with creative processes that form things. Okay, but anyway, the best definition of it is by Dewey, and there are others that have attempted to explain it since, and they don't understand it, which is very interesting to me because the problem continues in philosophy. And in science, even in new science, like quantum and all that. After 2,500 years of philosophers and later scientists trying to account for creation, not one has noticed this problem. Well, I am the one that noticed this problem. And you won't find anybody else talking about it. You won't. You won't. If you do, email me. My email is in the About section of the YouTube version of my my stuff. Their approach to conceiving of evolution of things prevented them from seeing, let alone rectifying this problem. They went on, coming up with new accounts of parts and particles imagined like the ones they saw around them, congealing to form the world we see. So they're projecting what they see back into its cause. And by the way, no one believes the theories, the modern theories anymore. Like you take the Big Bang Theory, which commits the historical fallacy, and I've gone over that several times. Nobody actually buys the Big Bang Theory. There's a joke about a comedian came up with. He said, in the beginning there was nothing, and then it exploded. That's very funny. Effectively, there was an infinite loop of projecting effects back into causes. We had no choice but to presuppose that space, time, mathematics, and current laws of nature, all part of the end product of the process, were here in the beginning of that process. And those things work together to make the things you see. So they really kind of like... Now, in EOP, we have another approach. All right? We approach the issue of creation in a whole different way, and this is the way that's referred to as the radical new view of reality in the subtitle of my second book, which is Re-explaining Evolution of Perception, a Radical New View of Reality. So we're going to talk about that radical new method of approaching the problem of how things got caused. Okay, so in EOP, we do a really strange thing. Remember, keep in mind, that when explaining how things got to be the way they are, we really only care about that the account is a plausible explanation of how they got the way they are now. The beginning of the story doesn't need to start out like things are now. That doesn't serve us. So we want to know how they are now came to have the characteristics we perceive in them. What does it matter to us if the beginning of the process that made things the way they are now, things were not that way? We want to explain how, for instance, solid objects we pick up, here's the cap to my water bottle. I need some water, by the way. How we want to explain how solid objects like that got their solidity. Okay, so we want to know, how did this get solid like this? It is not imperative that things like this formed out of materials that we could pick up and hold if we were back there at the beginning of time. That's not important to us. It could be wildly different. Tell me something where they weren't solid or there wasn't solidity. But in most of physics and philosophy, they were solid in the beginning. God created them, or they just were there. Like matter in reductive materialism always existed. And it had the properties that it has now. So they're reading the present conditions back into their cause. Now, if we imagine they were like that back then, that's committing the historical fallacy, because it's a process and we're reading into the beginning of the process that which ought to have come out as a result of the process. So long as the process we describe, so the point I'm making is, so long as the process we describe ends up giving us the world we observe, and with all its characteristics we find in it, that's good enough for us. And the only process that can do that, it turns out, is the theory of the evolution of perception. So the reason I prefaced with all that is that if the idea seems shocking and counterintuitive and it upsets somebody, that's why. It's not following the pattern of being like the things that we observe. We're not positing a condition like the effect to explain it. We want to explain the world around us. We don't want to start with the world around us. So when I say there was in the beginning this sort of latent infinite intelligence, we go, oh, that sounds so spiritual and mystic. I don't know. That's not science. There's the objection is the problem of the habit of the historical fallacy. It's not really a violating some kind of rule of science. But anyway, people feel like it is because it starts to approach a feel like is there intelligent design? And actually there isn't. This isn't an intelligent design theory. Anyone who's read my material will see that it's not that theory. The intelligent design theory where God, using a mind like ours, came up with the world is the historical fallacy, because we're trying to explain how we got minds like ours. But here, we're putting it back in the beginning as the cause of them. You see? So this is not intelligent design. It is something that I think when the philosophers hear what I've said, probably long after I'm dead, they're going to go, oh my God, why didn't somebody hear what Chris Ott was saying? And then they'll see, wow, and it was inspired by Meher Baba. Maybe we should look at what he says too. That's kind of my motive, by the way. My motive. So anyway, I'm now going to show EOP on my board. I'm going to draw it. Now, I've done this several times, and I have charts, and there's going to be some in this paper that I'm going to link to. You can look at these charts. They're better than the one I'm going to draw right now. But this is how I like to express the concept. Okay, let's get over here. All right. So we're going to start on the left. And I'm going to start. This is the process. So let's go back to the beginning of time. All right, about, or before time even, there was latently this infinite intelligence, okay? But I'm going to depict it as perceiving, because, my idea is called the evolution of perception. And there's a whole discussion there why I call it that. But that's enough. Okay? So I draw an eye looking to the right. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that there was some metaphysical, magical, invisible eye. The eye is a symbol, and it symbolizes perception, which isn't a thing. Perception is an act. It's to perceive, percepere in Latin, is a verb. Okay, so it seems strange to describe a process and begin with something that's really a verb, but the word perception is a verbal noun. It is the name of a kind of act. But I say it was latent originally, and it gradually begins to perceive the more it perceives and awakens and perceives, the more conscious it becomes. So one of the byproducts of this process I'm going to show is an evolution of consciousness. Okay, that's right in Meher Baba's teaching. He describes consciousness as a byproduct of this evolution that's underlying it. So now, so what is it that evolves in this process? How does perception change? Well, I always say, I'll talk about that. Maybe I should go do that and then come back to this. But we have, well, I'll just give it away. There's one more principle besides perception. There's ways of perceiving. And I call those perceptual schemas. All right, Meher Baba calls them sanskaras, which is a Sanskrit word, and it means an impression. But this impression is created by something that happened in the past, but it then colors all experience that happens thereafter. And I call these perceptual schemas, and a schema is an organization, and so it's a way of organizing perception. So I'm going to sort of jump. Whether you realize it or not, when you perceive something, you frame what you see. You look upon the object you are perceiving in a certain way. If I look upon a person in of a different nationality as bad because of his nationality, we say that the mode of perception I'm seeing him through is one of prejudice. My prejudice about such nationals preconditions my judgments of them. Such a way of looking I call a perceptual schema. Now that's a pretty common everyday kind of example, but in my books I explain there's other senses in which a way of perceiving colors and even forms what one sees. Let me just see something. Sorry. Okay. That's pretty simple. The source of a perceptual schema can always be traced back to some earlier experience we had that conditioned our thinking. That experience left an impression on me that schematized, organized my perception of people this way, and henceforth it colors all my experience of foreign people or from that country. A perceptual schema is not an invented entity, by the way. This isn't an invented entity. That we perceive is a fact, okay? It's actually undeniable. You can only deny it by contradicting yourself. And a schema, the fact that we organize our perception, it also is a fact that you can observe by introspecting about your perception and the things I'm saying right now. So these are not theoretical entities. All right? I haven't come up with some magical particle or something. These are dynamics that we experience every day, we use every day, and we're immediately, intimately familiar with. So what I've only done is I've given this a name. All right? I named it a perceptual schema. But as I said, in Hinduism, they have this an idea that's identical to this, really, which is called a sanskara. And Meher Baba writes about that. And he says that his entire teaching kind of comes down to the sanskara. The sanskara is what created the world. One after the other, though. Now, okay. The first sanskara that formed, I say, was time. Now, time isn't a thing. You can't go get a jar of time. Time is an aspect of our experience. We perceive things a certain way. We perceive them temporally. That means in terms of time. This and then this and then this. We don't just perceive things all once. And so time is the first schema, and it had to come first because there's no after without time, because before and after is a temporal concept. So time emerges as a way of perceiving in the beginning. And then, of course, space. Space is also not a thing. You can't get a jar of space. Well, you could get a jar of space, but that's just an empty jar. Space is not a thing. Air is a thing. But we see things spatially. So this is space. We'll write space here. Now we see things temporally and spatially. What do we see temporally and spatially? Initially, nothing. We're just seeing temporally and spatially. It's the perception and the how we perceive. But the beginning of this perception, trying to find something, produces first time and then space. And I talk about that in my books. And it's a hard thing to convey, but then we have more schemas, which are laws of nature. And laws of nature are what? They're ways of perceiving something. Well, we never thought of them that way. We didn't know what they were. But a law of nature is really a law of perception. And all laws of nature are reducible to ratios of time and space. So once you have time and space as ways of perceiving, you can perceive in terms of laws. So an example is gravity, which is obviously a very early law, but we always thought of it as a law of things. But that doesn't even make sense. Where did it come from? What is it? It's a law of perception. It governs how you perceive objects that are dropped. So when I drop this, guess what's going to happen? You're going to perceive, and I'm going to perceive, and anyone who wants to will perceive it drop, because it's a law of its being perceived, dropping. All right? Now you keep adding these laws, and finally you get the material world, because the material world is entirely describable in terms of the laws of physical laws of nature. You can describe in terms of them plus measurements. But what are laws of nature describable in terms of? They're describable in terms of numbers, okay? Number. All right, and I should explain that more, but I do in my books. But number, okay, a world is forming that's entirely numeric. It's sort of it's quantitative. It stays the same. Everybody who perceived it would perceive the same numbers. And I'm going to put on the screen some of the great minds that have said that the world forms out of number. That's in the Old Testament. Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, the philosopher Pythagoras. So this is not anything dramatic. Why did they say this? Because when they look at things, they realize, well, what does everything have in common? They have the numbers. How we see them and look upon them, that's different from person to person. But what's not different from person to person is the numerical values of everything and the laws, of course. And so now out of this world of number, in terms of the laws of nature, which are actually laws of perception, formed our physical bodies. But they originally formed out of number. So I can describe your physical body entirely in terms of number and geometry. Entirely. And here's somebody else, their body. But their body are actually of number. But then, as in the number state, brains, nervous systems, sense organs evolve and become more and more sensitive, those numbers are converted by that apparatus, by that media, into things like we see that have color and sound and smell and taste. Now, any young person who has played computer games is aware that on his disk, if he's been around long enough to actually use games on disks, those disks had recorded on them numbers. They were actually binaries, ones and zeros. But then, through the system, it gets converted into color and sound. But the color and sound are an interpretation of what's already there on the disk, which is this number. Okay? Well, that's what happens as you evolve. So you yourself are kind of in a number state, and then you evolve the media to convert those into what we call sensible qualities or sense data, like sound and color, pain, all these things. And eventually then, as people continue to live together amongst each other, they look at each other and they see each other's bodies, because even animals do. It's because this happens over evolution, by the way. And then gradually they look about and they make interpretations, like subjective interpretations. They're private, He's looking at things and he thinks that there's too many people in the world. He's a Malthusian, let's say. So he has those perceptual schemas that make him perceive things that way. Where this person loves people and he believes there should be more babies, and he thinks there's nothing more beautiful than a baby. And so he has those schemas. So you follow, and out of all this language becomes possible, psychology becomes possible, what we call meaning becomes possible. We form religions, everything out of schemas. And it's the same principle all the way back. But fundamentally, all there ever was this perceiving and ways of perceiving, and nothing else. People who see this idea, they always want to put in some other thing, the magical thing. No, you don't need it. Okay, that is the idea. Now, when I first wrote this idea back in the year, I actually wrote it for my professor who asked me to give him 10 pages with the idea. And I did, and he said he's from Stanford in philosophy, and actually wrote on perception in a journal called the Journal of Idealism. And he said, I've never heard this idea ever. And he said, you should develop it. And we were working on my thesis, and he wanted to scrap the thesis and start over and work on this because he said, this should be developed. But I said, I can't. I got to move on. I have student loans and things, and I don't have to. And plus, I want to publish it myself. And so a few years later, I dropped off in his box my book, The Evolution of Perception and the Cosmology of Substance, which was the idea that he actually read himself. And basically, the 10 pages I gave him are in the book. In fact, I think I have what page number they're in, and it's in here. In page 37 of the book. That was in 2004, so that's 19 years ago. And then a couple of years ago, in 2001, I rewrote it. Now, I rewrote the idea. I re-explained the idea. But after 17 years of thinking about it from the first book. But when I wrote the first book, I called it a theory, and I didn't push it. I said it seems possible, and I had reasons why it was a better theory than materialism or idealism or other ideas that had come before. But I didn't claim that we knew this was true. But in those 17 years between the first and the second, and really while I was preparing for the second book, it occurred to me that there were a priori reasons why it had to be the way I'd written it. I was using... All right. When you have an a priori reason or an a priori argument, or I make an a priori statement, it has to be true. Because of the words involved, actually. But without going into the concept of a priori ideas, there are a priori arguments why it had to be this way, and in even the order that I give them, like time and then space and then natural law before our bodies, there's an a priori reason, and it's called necessary preconditions. And you can just see from the word what I mean by that, but I'll go necessary. So examples of necessary preconditions that I wrote in this paper that you can link to is language is a necessary precondition for writing. How could we invent writing if we didn't even have talking? Okay. Another one is there could not have been motion before space. Space is a necessary condition for motion. But in previously, materialists and idealists, others who have tried to speculate about how things formed, they had motion, but they had no account of space forming, except, by the way, Immanuel Kant had a very similar idea about space and time, by the way. That's where I got the idea. Now, if you take the principle of necessary preconditions, it allows you to figure out, by moving backward from conditions to the necessary conditions for those conditions, you can actually find the schemas and the order in which they had to have evolved. They couldn't have evolved another way. Now, other theories don't even have to consider necessary preconditions. They're way outside of the loop of reasoning. They're just sort of fantasizing. But this is not what this is. I'm not fantasizing. I can't picture the formation of time as a way of seeing. That's not my imagination. That is me using the concept of what is the necessary conditions. How could you have laws, which are ratios of time and space, before time and space? And how could you have anything form before time? Therefore, time has to be first, space has to be second, the natural laws have to be third, and hey, we form out of the natural laws. So you really couldn't even have us and planets and the physical world, which are all based on number, without the natural laws. So therefore, this had to have come before this, and this had to come before this, and had to become. Now, where does all this lead us back to? If we go back, it doesn't just lead us to time. It leads us to perception, but not necessarily perceiving like we do, because that would be the historical fallacy. That would be reading our kind of perception back into the original form. That original form was more primordial. And so we probably can't describe it, but this is probably what mystics have tried to explain to us by calling it God. It wasn't a person. It was this dynamic, okay? And there's so many things this solves in philosophy. It's very exciting, but sadly I've had to live all these years with it all alone. I can't celebrate with anybody and get drunk, but this is really very cool. So now let's get back to our then I go over proving that this is what Baba does teach, because some of his words that he said have been misinterpreted, but if you interpret them very precisely, he's saying the world appeared from this point. This is what he calls the creation point, and the world appeared and went on expanding, the apparent world, because the world is an illusion, because it's only the effect of the perceptual schemas. And remember, perceptual schemas are not themselves things, and they're not even a theoretical entity. Anybody can find them in his own perceptual dynamic if he just introspects about it. Okay, so this is what Baba taught. Now, how does this help us to understand what he taught? Well, I take some lines by him and even other mystics, and you can just point to it. Like this is by Meher Baba. It's called "From the Seven Realities." It's a message that he wrote in 1941, and you can find them online. The Seven Realities. The first one is the only real existence is that of the one and only God, who is the self in every self. Okay? There's only really one seer here. There's only one person, or as we say, one soul. But sometimes we talk about souls, okay? Here's me and my perception, here's you. And so we are really one. So when Meher Baba says you and I are not we but one, he means although we appear to be many in the world of appearance, we are really one. Okay? He's not contradicting himself. He's saying appearance is not the same as reality. But he admits that it appears this way, and there is a sense in which we are several. We're gathered in this room. Here's another. This is in Meher Baba's main book. It's in the second edition, any edition after 1973, God Speaks, by Meher Baba, written in 1955. It's in the introduction, but it's taken from another source of Baba's writing, and the line is, "The religion that I shall give teaches the knowledge of the one behind the many." I love the word behind the many. It's sort of like God's not out there behind the clouds, like Harari says. God is more in a sense, and this is just a metaphor, behind you, looking through you, because he is the real you. But you have to have that experience in the real sense of realizing it through a long, long process, and then you realize I was all along the creator of my universe. That's Baba's teaching, by the way. And that's the theme of creation. Now, Baba said, it's in Time magazine, 1932, in May, Baba said, he ends what he was saying to the reporter, what I am, you are. So he is experiencing himself like here. What I am, you are. We are one. Well, there's only one person here, and it's God. You remember I said in the earlier talk about what Mayor Baba really taught, I said it's kind of like saying there is no God, there's only God, because there's not a God. That's just a silly, archaic concept. Comes from the days of tribalism, where tribes had their gods that protected them, and they went to war over gods. But Baba doesn't teach that. He says many gods is madness. And he says there's one, God is so much one that even to say that there's one God isn't right, because there only is God. So what are we even talking about? All right? But we start to see and understand that, kind of grok that. To grok something, it's a new word, and it means to really imbibe it and have an intuitive grasp of it. And this, for me, has allowed me to do that. And I noticed that right away. As soon as this came to me on that bus, I was like, wait a minute. This is what the masters are saying. Now, it's not just Baba. By the way, it's Jesus. He says, here's Jesus, here's his disciples around him, and he says, the kingdom of God is within you. Okay? That's Luke 17:21. And he says, insomuch as you have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Because we are all, in a sense, Jesus. Except Jesus is the full expression and conscious aspect of this that comes again and again, according to Mayor Baba, the avatar. And this line is from John 14:20. At the day ye shall know, at that day ye shall know that I am in the Father, and ye in me, and I in you. This word "in" is a hard word. It's used by mystics, and it's not a literal like there's a spoon in the jar. It's more like "is." You know, when the kingdom of heaven is within me, it means it's part of me. It's part of what I really am. It's okay. Now I like this line, although this one's a little harder. Maybe I'm taking this too far. But one of the most mysterious lines in the Bible is about the mustard seed, which is a point, which Baba calls the creation point. So if this were talking about the creation point, to me it would make sense. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all seeds on earth. Yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all gardens, with such big branches that the birds can perch in the shade. So the whole world comes out of a mustard seed, which is the kingdom. There's nothing really but the kingdom. Mark 4:31-32. Here's the one I said at the beginning. People bang the table because that doesn't make sense. I don't understand what Baba means. This is from Baba's God Speaks Again, and it's 1973, second edition, page 274. He says, God alone is real. The universe by itself is illusion. Okay? It's interesting he says by itself, because in the sense in which it is his own imagination, there's sort of a reality to it. because it's part of him. But by itself, it's just an illusion, a dream. It's the emerging appearance that happens when God begins to schematize his own seeing, when that begins to occur naturally. Now, that's pretty much what I have written here, and in the paper, which I'm going to link to. So, if you're on YouTube or you're on BitChute or Rumble, where I have my videos, you simply scroll down. Sometimes you have to hit more, and you'll see in the show notes that I have put a link to this document that I've been following, which is 12 pages long. It has some charts at the end. It has a much harder quote by Meher Baba, truly, truly difficult. The opening paragraphs to his intelligence notebooks, which were found after his death, by the way. And I have an edit that I did in 2012, and I link to it where you can download it yourself and you can read the whole thing. And it really will go into Baba's teaching more like this than in other places, where it goes, and he even uses the analogy of the glass. No, there was one more thing I wanted to say, and I think it's important, and it's the place to say it. When we talk about perception for a moment, let's just talk about perceiving, because this is an evolution of perceiving, literally perceiving things. Finally, when you get out here, in the beginning, it's more subtle, but when we talk about perception, there is a certain sense of directionality to perceiving. So let's say I'm in a museum and I'm looking at a painting by Van Gogh. So which direction is the perceiving going? Okay, if you had to do a little picture of me in the museum and I'm staring at the painting, which way would you do the arrows if you were going to show that which way perception moves with arrows? Well, I don't know how. Some people would draw it from my eyes to the painting, which is like this chart, because everything's sort of coming out of an eye. And even here, it's sort of being produced by how you're perceiving. But I don't mean this literally, and neither would you. You wouldn't know quite sure what you meant, but I want to talk about that. From a physical standpoint, the data that's, for instance, in the data that's in frequencies of light, frequencies of sound, which is certain hertz of vibration, those move toward your eyes and then back along your optic nerve to your brain. So they're moving toward you. And that's physically true. But so what am I trying to describe when I show it going the opposite way? Isn't that counterintuitive? I'm showing all this perception going toward the object. Out here would be, if I could sort of draw the world, whatever it is at the moment, through your schemas that you would see. That's your object of perception. Well, what is it that's moving that way? Okay, that direction, which is from the perceiver to his object, is the direction of causation. So it's moving from first cause to effect, because this is an effect and it has an effect, and then that effect has an effect, which has an effect, which has an effect. You're moving from causes to effects, and the world is effect. And in God Speaks, Baba literally says that the original whim of God to know himself, which is what caused this to happen, is the cause, in the sense of the original cause. And it ends up with the universe, which he says is the effect. So now we have an idea of cause and effect. And so I wanted to add that, because even I wondered, how am I going to explain this? Because I don't think the world comes out of your eyes. But I just want to say that there were Greek philosophers who did think that, including the Stoics and even Plato, who got that idea from Pythagoras, which was the idea that perception with the eyes, for instance, was a kind of a flame that came, an invisible flame that came out and merged with its object. And the Stoics had this too. They, out of all your orifices, like your ears and your nose and your mouth, your tongue, your eyes, came sort of what's called a psyche. And it went out there and it kind of tapped on the object. and then it sort of sent back a signal to you, and then there was a sixth organ. It was called the common sense. It didn't mean using common sense. It meant the sense that you have, and that all the other senses, like eyes and ears, have in common. And it would put together what the thing was. Like, so you saw a clown because these senses sent out, psych, and they got a signal back. So that's the Stoics. So people have actually thought that perception comes out of you toward its object, but that's not what I'm saying. I take a very natural, scientific view of everything, and one of the values of this is when you end up the final effect in the cause. It's very different than the effect. But when we get to the effect, which is what you perceive, the objects that you perceive, like, they are nuts and bolts exactly as described by physical science. So there's nothing counterintuitive really about this. It only seems that way because I'm starting in a very strange place. But that hadn't been thought of before, that evolution of perception. But when you understand what I'm saying and that you accept, okay, that's pretty weird, but is this a plausible explanation for things as we find them in our experience? Yes, it is. Because the world ends up being law-governed. Some of it is the same for everybody, like how many wheelbarrows are in the truck, but are they good wheelbarrows? That's a judgment, so that's different from person to person. And that's all accounted for this way. So the effect is entirely consistent with materialism. Isn't that funny? Not with reductive materialism, because that's a theory that everything is only matter, and that's the explanation for things, which actually doesn't work. And every reductive materialist actually knows that. It's a theory that doesn't work. I've talked about that in other places. I don't have time now. This has been enough. Anyway, this is the talk about, I'm finishing up, how EOP, the evolution of perception, this idea I've worked on for so long, which I abbreviate as EOP, how the evolution of perception concept is useful in understanding the counterintuitive claims of the mystics. Thank you very much. I appreciate anybody who's following these, and there will be a number 21 coming soon. And take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.